Today, we're diving into one of the most famous and, let's be honest, most controversial studies in the history of psychology. We're talking about the Milgram Experiment. It's a study that pulls back the curtain on the incredible and kind of unsettling power of authority.
So let me just start by asking you this. Would you obey an order to harm an innocent person? I mean, of course, your gut reaction is probably no way, right? We all see ourselves as good people who think for ourselves, but back in the early 1960s, a psychologist decided to really put that idea to the test. And the results? They absolutely shocked the world.
You know, the story here doesn't actually begin in a science lab. It starts in a courtroom. The world was still reeling from the horrors of World War II and the Holocaust, and the trial of a high-ranking Nazi officer, Adolf Eichmann, was being broadcast everywhere. His defense for his terrible crimes? He claimed he wasn't some monster, he was just a guy following orders. And that defense raised this terrifying question: could any ordinary person be turned into an agent of terror, just by someone in charge telling them to do it?
That's the exact question that psychologist Stanley Milgram wanted to answer. So, at the prestigious Yale University, he designed this really ingenious experiment to see just how far regular people, everyday citizens from New Haven, Connecticut, would actually go when obeying an authority figure, especially when those commands went against their own conscience.
Now, the setup for this was a masterpiece of deception. When participants showed up, they drew slips of paper for their role, either teacher or learner. But surprise, the whole thing was rigged. The real participant was always the teacher. The learner? He was an actor, part of the whole setup. The teacher would watch as this learner was strapped into a chair, electrodes attached to his arm. The teacher's job was to give him an electric shock for every wrong answer on a memory test. And with each mistake, the voltage would go up by 15 volts. And watching over the whole thing was the experimenter, this very stern-looking guy in a gray lab coat.
So, as you can imagine, as the shocks got stronger, the tension in the room just skyrocketed. The actor playing the learner would start to protest. He'd mention he had a heart condition. Then he'd grunt in pain, then start shouting, then screaming in pure agony. And eventually, after one last horrible scream, he'd just fall completely silent, as if he'd passed out or maybe something even worse.
And every single time the teacher hesitated, maybe turned to the experimenter and said, "Hey, I don't know about this," they were met with these really calm, firm prods. There were no threats, just simple, authoritative statements like, "Please continue," or "The experiment requires that you continue." The pressure was just immense.
So, the big question: how far did people actually go? Milgram himself predicted almost no one would go all the way to the end. But in the most famous version of his study, a staggering 65% of participants obeyed orders all the way to the end. They administered the final massive 450-volt shock, a swish that was clearly labeled "danger, severe shock."
This result was, well, it was deeply disturbing. It kind of suggested that Eichmann's just following orders defense wasn't just a convenient excuse. It might actually be tapping into something powerful about human nature. The world wanted to know, why? Why did these normal people, who were visibly sweating and trembling and clearly distressed, keep pushing that button?
Okay, so Milgram and other researchers pinpointed a few key reasons for this shocking level of obedience. First, you have all the trappings of authority. The study was at Yale, a super respected university, and the guy in the lab coat looked official. Second, we're all trained from the time we're kids to listen to authority figures, parents, teachers, you name it. Third, participants felt kind of locked in. They'd agree to be there, they were getting paid, and they didn't want to be rude or mess up the science. And finally, you have the power of the situation itself. It's like a slippery slope. Starting with a tiny 15-volt shock made it way easier psychologically to give the next one, and the next, and the one after that. This diagram here kind of puts it all into perspective. It shows that authority is just one way people can be persuaded. It basically works because we're motivated to avoid some kind of punishment or get a reward. It's direct external pressure that's really different from being persuaded by, say, someone's credibility, where you actually believe what they're saying, or their attractiveness, where you want to be like them. What happened in Milgram's experiment? That was pure, raw authority in action.
But Milgram's work didn't just get accepted, no questions asked. Oh no. Almost as soon as the results were published, the study became a lightning rod for criticism. It sparked this huge, fierce debate about the ethics and even the validity of his work. That is, believe it or not, still going on today.
And the list of criticisms was long. I mean, ethically, this thing was a minefield. Participants were lied to and put through some serious psychological anguish. And some of them weren't even told the truth right away. Methodologically, some critics argued that the whole setup was just not believable, that people must have known the shocks weren't real.
And even more recently, some historians looking back at the data say the participants weren't just blindly obeying. They were actually conflicted people who chose to believe they were helping advance a noble scientific cause.
This quote from another psychologist, Diana Baumrind, written right after the study came out, just perfectly captures the moral outrage a lot of people felt. She cut right to the heart of it, questioning the ethics of a study that would deceive people who trusted the researchers and cause them so much genuine distress.
So, because of all this ethical fallout, a full-on, exact replication of Milgram's experiment just became impossible. But that leaves the big question. Does the main idea still hold up today? Well, in 2009, a researcher named Jerry Berger did a partial replication with much stricter ethical rules. He stopped the experiment at 150 volts. That's the point where the learner first cries out. And the result? 70% of his participants were ready to keep going. That number is not statistically different from what Milgram found. The power of the situation, it seems, is still very much with us.
So, okay, this is not just some fascinating old experiment from a lab. It's really like a mirror, reflecting things we see happening all around us, all the time. This conflict between our own conscience and what an authority figure tells us to do, it's a constant theme in human history and in our own daily lives.
I mean, we can connect it right back to where it all started, the Holocaust. Milgram's work gave us a powerful, even if incomplete, explanation for how so many regular German citizens and soldiers could take part in something so horrific.
And we see echoes of it in much more recent history, too. Think about the prisoner abuse scandal at Abu Ghraib in Iraq. U.S. soldiers committed these awful acts of torture and humiliation. And what did many of them say later? That they were just following orders from higher-ups in a really high-pressure situation.
This power of just perceived authority can be twisted in some really shocking ways. Back in 2004, a guy called a fast food restaurant, pretended to be a police officer, and convinced the manager to strip search a young female employee because of a supposed theft. The manager just did it, following the instructions of a voice on a phone.
And look, on a much more everyday level, this pressure to obey is everywhere. A survey found that an incredible 88% of administrative assistants said they've told a white lie for their boss. It might seem like a small thing, but it's that exact same fundamental tension that Milgram's experiment laid bare.
And so that brings it all the way back around to you. The Milgram experiment leaves us all with this one really haunting question. When we're in those moments of pressure, when someone in charge asks us to bend our rules or compromise what we believe in, what are we going to do? It forces us to think not just about the order we're being given, but about how our future self, the person we have to live with, will feel about the choice we make today.